I caught him in several lies.
Detective Simmons said this of James Weir, the informant who had said that Bill Arrowsmith and Warren Musselwhite paid him $3,000 to drive them to Patty's house so they could kill her because she found out about money laundering at the State Bank of Apopka, where she and Arrowsmith worked. FDLE agent Barr said that he believed James Weir had made up the story, and that he did so in order to get out of pending grand theft charges. Detective Simmons told reporters that he tried to set up a polygraph for Weir, but he escaped the Seminole County jail and ran. When they got him back, he changed his mind about the polygraph. Detective Simmons was eventually transferred, so his tenure on the case of Patty Smith ended, and it's reported that no one worked Patty's case again until around 1982, 4 years after the homicide. Then Detectives Ron Gilbert and Lieutenant George Haygood gave it a go. They reportedly thought it was linked to another Seminole County murder, but that ended up being another dead end. And that is when FDLE agent John Barr entered stage right. He re-interviewed family, the former boyfriend, Musselwhite, Weir the informant, neighbors, friends, and co-workers. He spent some time working on the boyfriend, who was then in North Carolina. Ramey Folk had received, quote, many loans from the State Bank of Apopka, with Patty's help, and had deposited $11,000 in a North Carolina bank 3 months after she died. For a long time, he refused to take a polygraph. He insisted that he was innocent. Eventually, he did return to Florida and he took a polygraph for FDLE agent Barr, and it was reported in the paper that polygraph indicated that he was being truthful about his innocence, as well as how the money that he had deposited came from the sale of some property that he owned. Agent Barr said he also vetted Mr. Weir, the informant who implicated Arrowsmith the banker, who worked with Patty, and his friend and business associate Warren Musselwhite. After multiple polygraphs and interviews, Agent Barr said that James Weir admitted to lying about Arrowsmith and Musselwhite. Agent Barr believed that Weir had gotten bits of information from relatives while he was incarcerated, and then concocted a story. The newspaper reported that Weir would later take a polygraph for FBI agents, but they failed to mention what that result was. They also reported that Musselwhite had passed his polygraph, but Agent Barr could not get Arrowsmith to take one. The newspaper reported that Bill Arrowsmith claimed that Agent Barr had used Patty Smith's death as an excuse to pursue him. Barr said,
He believes I'm after him, and I want to pin something on him. I just want to eliminate him as a suspect once and for all and move on.
Arrowsmith said,
Their whole case rested on a star witness who finally stood up and said, Just kiddin', boys.
Arrowsmith contended that law enforcement was being neglectful by letting James Weir walk. Agent Barr countered that Weir had a drug problem and was trying to rehabilitate himself. He had a job. Barr didn't see what purpose it would serve to charge him with anything. So the agent, who had spent 800 hours of his life on the case, traveled out of state, and estimated around $20,000 of taxpayer resources spent on the investigation, had seemingly landed right back where he started. I will note that this article seems to have conflicting information. At one point, Barr is quoted as saying that he had ruled out his only 3 suspects, Arrowsmith, Musselwhite, and Folk. Yet he's also quoted in the same article as saying,
I just want to eliminate him as a suspect once and for all, and move on.
That's conflicting, but I will say that no good member of law enforcement is ruling anyone in or out based on a polygraph. Innocent people fail them, and guilty people pass them all the time. While they were relied heavily upon in decades previous, we now understand, broadly, that a polygraph is a tool and nothing more. It's not evidence of anything, and it certainly should not be used to rule in or rule out a suspect. But the thing that complicates Patty Smith's case is the drug smuggling investigation that involved so many local names you'd need one of those maps with arrows on a huge whiteboard to keep track. Picture me trying to illustrate all of the movers and shakers on The Sopranos. Well, this is that, but instead of Italians with guns and gabagool, it's middle-aged white nurserymen with biscuits and gravy, and a whole lot of pot. And this wasn't the only drug smuggling investigation going on in Florida during this time. In fact, there were years-long, wide-sweeping investigations all over the state, because drug smuggling was rampant and unchecked in the 1970s and 80s.
Now about a Florida fishing community where Steve Croft reports the local economy went to pot.
By 5:30 this morning, a police roadblock had cut the only highway into town, and Everglades City was swarming with hundreds of federal agents and sheriff's deputies.
The arrests began shortly before sunrise. By midday today, 23 people were taken into custody. The Drug Enforcement Administration says this community is the hub of an international marijuana smuggling ring, that boatmen here unloaded drugs from mother vessels and helped distribute them throughout the country.
We don't have shoot-'em-ups over drugs or gangland killings or anything like that. Like I said, they're breaking the law, but they're not violent criminals.
No, these are your next-door neighbors, people you were born and raised with, and they're just typical American people.
Nobody went to jail for that. That's just everyday life here.
Nearly 500,000 pounds of marijuana have been seized in the area since the undercover operation began 2 years ago.
Just everybody was broke, needed some money, and they all figured one time and all quit.
But they didn't quit. The houses got remodeled, the crab boats got radar, and Everglades City flourished.
This town is nice. It is nice. And if there is any drug traffic here, all I can say is it's helped this place.
Everyone knew it was going on. A lot of people didn't like it. But this is not the kind of a place where you turn in your neighbor. It's the kind of place where people have always done what they had to do to get by. More than 200 people have been indicted since the federal government moved its agents in 1981. Today's roster included a former sheriff's deputy and a former state Supreme Court justice who's still at large.
It won't change anything. It'll just be more money in it, I guess. Price will go up.
During this time, there was a statewide effort to prosecute some cases that met federal guidelines, allowing for the feds to take over some of that burden. But state and local agents really had their hands full, and many of these cases had players that crossed county and state lines. Operation Everglades, for example, was a 2-year operation that included federal agents, and the Collier County Sheriff's Department cast a wide net that snagged up a former Supreme Court justice and multiple former and present law enforcement agents, who were all indicted on federal drug charges. In many of the cases that I looked at, there seemed to be a current or former cop involved and local politicians in the mix. In other words, people who worked the levers of power in their jurisdictions. I'm going to fall back on my trusty timeline to tell the tale of the drug smuggling/money laundering case that touched Patty Smith's case, and it involved the vice president of Patty's bank, Bill Arrowsmith. He and another man named Warren Musselwhite were implicated by James Weir, who, Agent Barr said, had lied. But we can almost take the tipster out of the equation and see why law enforcement would have wanted to talk to Bill Arrowsmith and Warren Musselwhite in the Patty Smith case. The banker and sitting Apopka city councilman was being accused of money laundering, and the details that would come out about that included activities that leaned a little too close to motive if Patty Smith had caught wind of it at work. Arrowsmith was reportedly friends with Warren Musselwhite, another local who owned a car lot and a few other business ventures. I found a listing of a $33,000 transaction between the two in the Orlando Sentinel in 1977, just a month before Patty was promoted to Assistant Operations Officer at the State Bank of Apopka. Just for context, she was killed in June of '78. Months later, in March of 1979, a search warrant was executed in Lee County for a house as well as vessels and vehicles found within its curtilage. Curtilage includes the area immediately surrounding a dwelling, and it counts as part of the home for many legal purposes. Search warrants must be specific, and this will come up in a bit because once legal proceedings begin, the appeals start flying. At any rate, there was a vehicle parked in the driveway of that home in Lee County, and that vehicle was owned by Warren Musselwhite, according to the title found in the glove compartment. Police also found pot remnants in the car. In a related Polk County case, police seized 16,000 pounds of pot 2 months later, and then the grand jury proceedings began. In October of 1979, multiple employees of the State Bank of Apopka, where Patty worked, testified before the grand jury, to include the teller operations officer and an executive teller. Employees from another bank in Forest City testified as well. James Hubbard, the teller operations officer, had been ordered to bring the records of J. William Arrowsmith. That week, officials from the bank reached out to local newspapers in Apopka and Orlando to assure the press that none of their employees were suspects in any drug smuggling investigation. They said employees were being subpoenaed to provide information about customer accounts. Despite the state attorney saying at the time his staff was, quote, not really focusing our attention on Mr. Arrowsmith, he also said that he could not predict what the grand jury would do relative to Arrowsmith. Then, on October 30th, 1979, just 3 weeks after that grand jury proceeding, Bill Arrowsmith would give a 143-page statement to Lee County state attorney officials. Meanwhile, a couple months after that, Arrowsmith defeated his opponent to begin his third term. One media outlet reported,
according to Apopka political observers, Arrowsmith's appearance before the grand jury was a hot political issue in the city until the Apopka chief published an article which said that Arrowsmith had been cleared of any involvement in drug smuggling.
And again, that was a bit more PR, since it wasn't the drug smuggling but the money laundering aspect that law enforcement believed Arrowsmith allegedly had information about. More arrests continued in the ensuing months. A man named John Wayne Giles, along with 3 other men, were arrested in Polk County on drug smuggling charges. They were all wanted in connection with importing large quantities of marijuana by air and by boat. This was the culmination of a 9-month investigation that had started in the beginning of 1979, just months after Patty's death. Warren Musselwhite was picked up near his car lot in Pine Hills. Apparently, law enforcement had a tail on him at the time. Just before his arrest, he had seen the occupants of the vehicle with binoculars, so he called the Orange County Sheriff's Office and told them there were people across the street watching him. A obviously paranoid Musselwhite even took a few Polaroid pictures while he waited for police to come and find out who they were. When the sheriff's office got there, Musselwhite was arrested. Later, he told them he was terrified that they were hitmen. And that implies that he understood the stakes were pretty damn high. Because if you think someone might hire a hitman to kill you, you're probably in deep enough shit that you think they have a reason to do so. Musselwhite was arrested along with Robert Traynor, a Broward County man who owned a nursery, and they were indicted in September of 1979 in Lee County, along with 33 people throughout Florida. A dragnet reportedly snagged another 21 people the day after the indictment, and all told, they believed that the ring had smuggled marijuana worth more than $200 million into the state of Florida. And as one might imagine, when dozens of people within the same loose pot smuggling organization all get arrested at once, they all start ratting each other out. It's every man for himself. At the beginning of 1980, the Orlando Sentinel reported that the state attorney was probing Bill Arrowsmith's campaign records. They confirmed that he was under investigation but said that criminal charges were not involved. Warren Musselwhite filed a motion to suppress the evidence found in his Lincoln that was parked in front of that home in Lee County where they confiscated all that marijuana, and that motion failed. And it's during this time, August of 1980, that James Weir, that informant who said he was paid to drive Musselwhite and Arrowsmith to Patty's house the night she was killed, got himself jammed up on some grand theft charges. And then sometime between February 7th, 1984 and March 7th, 1984, there was an important turn of events. Warren Musselwhite entered into a plea agreement with federal officials. On March 7th, after hearing testimony from Musselwhite and Agent Alteef, the grand jury which had been investigating Musselwhite returned an indictment against Bryant Hampton, Sonny Wilson, and Hooker Brown. Hampton was a realtor and former Naples city councilman. Hooker Brown was a former Collier County sheriff's deputy who resigned in 1979 after refusing to take a polygraph concerning phone calls to his home from some of the drug smugglers. A 5.5-year investigation ended in 1984 when Sonny Wilson, Hooker Brown, and Bryant Hampton all pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to import marijuana and agreed to cooperate with the government. A splashy Orlando Sentinel article in October of 1985, the following year, explained, quote, just how deeply rooted the illegal plant business is in the legal foliage business that formed, quote, the backbone of Northwest Orange County's economy. This article pulled together what had occurred in those investigations. They reported that 4 nurserymen had been arrested on drug charges, and the investigations involved federal, state, and local law enforcement. A drug smuggler named John Wayne Giles cooperated with police and described the details of the smuggling that involved more than 26,000 pounds of pot from 1979 to 1982. It appears that after a dip in profits in the late 1970s, some local nursery owners sought additional sources of income, and the foliage industry provided a great business to use as cover. A grand jury prosecutor said, quote,
it's just a lot of good old boy nurserymen doing a little bit on the side to help out in the lean times.
Those nurserymen, though, in some cases needed businessmen, which brings us to the allegations against Apopka City Councilman and banker Bill Arrowsmith, who worked with Patty Smith, our homicide victim. John Wayne Giles cut a deal with the feds for a 2-year prison sentence in return for narking on his associates. Giles was a former Marine Corps pilot who had married into an Apopka nursery family. Arrowsmith lived just down the road from Giles, and according to newspaper accounts, Giles' wife was once Arrowsmith's secretary. Giles would divorce and subsequently move to Ormond Beach, where he was first approached by a boat broker to fly in loads of pot from Colombia. But when that deal fell through, Giles hooked up with Joe Pegg of Fort Lauderdale, and Pegg had once headed one of the largest pot importing rings in the 1970s. Giles worked as an offloader on a 58-foot Hatteras that was used to meet one of the motherships, large freighters that carried tons of Colombian pot. So these motherships would offload pot to various smaller vessels offshore, and that's what Giles did, and he said he earned about $15,000 per trip. As he worked his way up Pegg's organization, he acquired interest in a half-dozen yachts and a few airplanes that were used in drug smuggling. Between runs, Giles would come back to Apopka and visit friends and family. Around 1979, he decided to open some businesses, a mortgage company, an investment company, and he acquired a nursery in Apopka. Now, the Apopka nurserymen that we're talking about are very small peanuts compared to someone like Joe Pegg. His story illustrates how much larger a fish he was than Giles and any of the people below him in the pecking order. Operation Grouper was the code name of a massive federal investigation that led to 165 indictments, and police said that ring operated in Louisiana, Georgia, and Florida, and it grossed about $300 million a year. That inquiry began in the fall of 1978, and it involved both federal and state agents who were acting as experts in getting marijuana to shore. The undercover agents basically offered drug smugglers a safe harbor to dock their marijuana-filled ships and then work crews to unload the illegal pot. Giles alleged that he and Bill Arrowsmith planned to build a restaurant together on a piece of land near the intersection of 441 and 436. But then it all went south when FDLE seized 3 of his boats in South Florida, chock full of pot, and arrested his employees. Those employees flipped on him, and so he and his brother were indicted. From the Orlando Sentinel article on October 13, 1985.
By September of 1980, Giles was free on bond, but caught in a vice. On one side were prosecutors threatening Giles with 30 long years in prison if he refused to talk. On the other was his boss, Joe Pegg, making veiled threats about what would happen if he talked. Giles ran. He hid in Kingston, Jamaica for about 18 months, then returned to the United States aboard a drug plane in 1982. Giles surrendered and made a deal with prosecutors for a light sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Prosecutors said that he refused to talk unless they kept his brother out of jail. They agreed not to charge Tim Giles. Giles said that other Apopka nurserymen became involved while he was running a smuggling operation headed by Davis Lynn Fatt from 1980 to early 82. He said that Edward McCaskill, a nurseryman who had a crop dusting business, flew to Jamaica to pick up 400 pounds of sinsemilla, high-grade pot worth $1,000 a pound. One of McCaskill's employees, Charles Doran of Mount Dora, was with him. A week later, McCaskill returned to Jamaica to pick up another 400 pounds of what investigators called Jamaican gold. Giles flew home with him and lived secretly in the United States. He married an Apopka woman and lived in various southeastern states, taking on false identities. Giles said that he was broke by early 85, his daughter needed medical treatment, and his wife was tired of running, so he surrendered. "It finally dawned on me," Giles said. "This camaraderie thing was great for the Marine Corps, but it wasn't for guys that smuggle marijuana." He named 2 people that he said were above him in the organization, Lynn Fatt and former Fort Lauderdale policeman Gerald Smith, along with McCaskill, Doran, Ward, Aerosmith, nurseryman Jim Shirley, and Warren Musselwhite, all as associates in the drug business.
By the time this article was published in 1985, Warren Musselwhite was serving a 4-year federal prison sentence for drug and money laundering violations. The article went on to say one of those named by Giles said Giles was involved in bigger drug deals but chose to name people involved in a relatively minor drug scheme so none of the big bosses would retaliate.
"He consumes people like an anteater eats ants,"
the associate said.
"God messed up when John Giles was born."
That all makes sense. Giles ratting out the lower people on the totem pole, because if he ratted out the bigger guys, his life was on the line. But what it tells you is there were stakes involved for everybody, because if Giles is afraid of the people above him, then that indicates that the people below him on the totem pole might be afraid of them too. Giles alleged that Bill Aerosmith had helped him weigh marijuana once in 1979. He alleged that he had stolen drug money from Giles to use as a down payment on a condo in New Smyrna Beach, and he alleged that Aerosmith had laundered drug money for him and Musselwhite, who was a friend of Aerosmith's. Giles alleged that he had lent Aerosmith $125,000 in 1979 to help build that Apopka restaurant, and that Aerosmith knew the money that came delivered to him in cash in a briefcase was drug money. For his part, Aerosmith told investigators the money came from a Cayman Islands investor named George Wren. Giles insisted that he and Aerosmith had concocted a fake person named George Wren, and there was no such person. Aerosmith alleged that Giles was lying to get a reduced sentence. He said, quote,
"He's desperate. If I were in his shoes, I might do the same thing. I don't hate him for it."
Aerosmith said his anger is directed at investigators who have been working for 6 years to pin something on him.
"There's just enough of that common thread to come out with that beautiful yarn,"
he said.
"They have it set in their minds to weave something, but they can't get to the end of it."
But Aerosmith said he admired Giles as an astute businessman. He said Giles could have had a successful nursery without drug profits. Aerosmith, the newspaper went on to report, said that he just ignores Giles' accusations.
"There's nothing I can do. I'm just waiting for somebody to make the next move."
Now, I want to be clear. Aerosmith was indicted multiple times, none of which successfully, but a lot was learned in that process. During the investigation, state officials suspended Aerosmith from banking activities, and it was learned that he had bought multiple cashier's checks for a bank customer, which were then used to buy a home in Bonita Springs, where 13,000 pounds of marijuana was stored. At that time, Aerosmith gave that long, detailed statement to, quote,
"Cooperate with the end result to be that I would not be indicted after they had a chance to check on everything I told them."
Former Orange County Deputy David Moore, at the time with the FBI, said that Aerosmith was asked for a statement because, quote,
We felt his participation had been minimal in money laundering and his cooperation would be more advantageous.
He agreed, though, there was an implication that if Arrowsmith's statement was truthful, the banker would not be charged. Arrowsmith was given implied immunity for his statement. Turns out the evidence that was used to charge Arrowsmith came from that 143-page statement. His involvement in the federal drug case on the money laundering was never fully adjudicated in front of a jury, despite certain admissions made by him. John Wayne Giles was charged as a co-conspirator of Arrowsmith before he had even fled the state. When he returned, he voluntarily surrendered to Orlando authorities and implicated Arrowsmith in several drug-related deals. Giles pleaded guilty to conspiring with Arrowsmith to conceal the source of $90,000 used to buy land in Apopka. His plea agreement stated that he gave Arrowsmith, a neighbor at the time, $125,000 in cash in early 1979, so Arrowsmith could buy some property to build a restaurant. The money came from Giles' drug dealings, he said, and he contended, quote,
Arrowsmith knew that the source was marijuana from previous discussions and drug dealings which he had had with John Giles.
The third indictment in 1986 accused Arrowsmith and Giles of setting up a sham corporation to buy land with Giles' pot smuggling profits. Giles alleged that he gave Arrowsmith $125,000 and Arrowsmith bought 10 cashier's checks in $9,000 increments at several Orlando banks to avoid filing federal currency transaction reports. According to the indictment, Arrowsmith made a $5,000 down payment on the land at 436 and 441 in Apopka. Then 6 weeks later, according to the indictment, Arrowsmith, Giles, and lawyer George Kelly formed a corporation called Hillside Investments to conceal Giles' interest in the property. The indictment said that Arrowsmith accepted $125,000 from Giles at the end of that meeting, put it in a safety deposit box at the State Bank of Apopka, and then bought cashier's checks with it. The indictment said over several weeks, Arrowsmith gave Kelly about $100,000 to buy the land. When Giles asked Arrowsmith for his money back in June of 1980, the indictment said that Arrowsmith obtained a $70,000 bank loan with a falsified affidavit and then repaid Giles $75,000 a few months later. The indictment stated that Arrowsmith gave Giles' brother a gold Rolex watch to cover the balance. In both previously dropped cases, federal investigators insisted that Arrowsmith had lied to them to cover up his money laundering activities with Giles. Arrowsmith said that he had nothing to hide and had even used his own name on the cashier's checks. Arrowsmith maintained that he had no illegal intent in buying the 10 cashier's checks. He said that he bought them at different banks for privacy, so people in Apopka would not know the details of his personal business. Arrowsmith did admit to receiving $125,000 in a briefcase from a Cayman Islands investor named George Wren, to which he said Giles had introduced him during a meeting at an Apopka restaurant parking lot. Arrowsmith said that he never saw the man again and was to repay the loan within a year at 11% interest. He was unaware that the money came from drug ventures. Giles' version was that he lent $125,000 to Arrowsmith in a restaurant deal in which they were both partners. He said that Arrowsmith lied about the price of the land and secretly used $15,000 of the money to put a down payment on a beachfront condo, and he insisted again that George Wren did not exist. This thread of the case, this theory that the drug smuggling and money laundering cases were related to Patty's death, remains, at least in the public sphere to this day. Mr. Arrowsmith served on the Apopka City Council for nearly 4 decades, serving longer than any other Apopkan to date, except the late Mayor John Land. While researching this case, I found a post on Facebook from July of 2023. The poster said that the upcoming Apopka City Council had it on their agenda to change the name of Harmon Road to Bill Arrowsmith Road. That poster went on to remind the readers of his past criminal indictments, as well as an ethics investigation related to loans from his bank to the city. And this poster also brought up Patti Smith's name, and Aerosmith having been mentioned as a person of interest in her case, which I mentioned earlier had happened when FDLE agent Barr named 3 possible suspects: Aerosmith, Musselwhite, and Folk. In an Orlando Sentinel article on August 2nd, 2023, that proposal to name a street after Aerosmith was described as going sour when, quote, animosity stymied the proposition. Aerosmith responded on Facebook.
Last week, while on vacation out west, I was informed that there was an agenda item at the City Commission meeting to change the name of Harmon Road to Bill Aerosmith Parkway. If someone was trying to surprise me, it worked. I understand that it was a very contentious meeting, with the usual creeps blasting me. If this had passed, I would have rejected the move, as I would not condone replacing an historical pioneer, Harmon. I served 39 plus years as commissioner/vice mayor of this great city and appreciate the gesture, but have asked that it be removed from consideration at this time. I thank those that spoke in favor and apologize for the meeting conduct that you had to endure. Apopka proud.
Stay tuned.